We begin a new series tonight in our journey through the minor prophets. Minor not because of insignificance, but because of the short prophetic books that close the New Testament. Having studied the book of Hosea with Abner Chow, we now move to the book of Joel, the place of my responsibility, and we'll spend 4 weeks on the book of Joel, one of the most, as far as my study, one of the most compelling books I've ever studied. I found great profit in these pages, and I hope you will as well. Tonight, our goal is, I think, pretty clear. I want to just make it through chapter 1. If we can do chapter 1, verses 1 through 20, we'll be on track. I have a threefold agenda that I'm willing to share with you right out the gate. We have 3 things we're going to do tonight. We're going to learn about locusts. We're going to lean into lament, and we're going to look to the Lord. I think that's the 3 things that Joel chapter 1 would have us do just to really gain an understanding of this great book and unfold its treasures and really see how this truth applies to our lives and our worship. So we need to learn about locusts, lean into lament, and look to the Lord. So to start, let's read the text. Joel chapter 1, verse 1 through 20. The word of Yahweh that came to Joel, the son of Pethuel. Hear this, O elders, and give ear, all inhabitants of the land. Has anything like this happened in your days, or in your father's days? Recount about it to your sons, and let your sons recount about it to their sons, and their sons to the next generation. What the gnawing locust has left, the swarming locust has consumed. And what the swarming locust has left, the creeping locust has consumed. And what the creeping locust has left, the stripping locust has consumed. Awake, drunkards, and weep, and wail, all you wine drinkers, on account of the sweet wine that is cut off from your mouth. For a nation has come up against my land, mighty and without number. Its teeth are the teeth of a lion, and it has the fangs of a lioness. It has made my vine a desolation, and my fig tree splinters. It has stripped them bare and cast them away. Their branches have become white. Wail like a virgin girded with sackcloth. For the bridegroom of her youth, the grain offering and the drink offering are cut off from the house of Yahweh. The priests mourn, the ministers of Yahweh. The field is destroyed. The land mourns, for the grain is destroyed. The new wine dries up. Fresh oil fails. Be ashamed, O farmers. Wail, O vine dressers, for the wheat and the barley, because the harvest of the field perishes. The vine dries up and the fig tree fails, the pomegranate, the palm also, and the apple tree. All the trees of the field dry up. Indeed, rejoicing dries up from the sons of men. Gird yourselves with sackcloth and lament, O priests. Wail, O ministers of the altar. Come spend the night in sackcloth, O ministers of my God, for the grain offering and the drink offering are withheld from the house of your God. Set apart a fast as holy. Call for a solemn assembly. Gather the elders and all the inhabitants of the land to the house of Yahweh your God, and cry out to Yahweh. Alas, for the day of Yahweh is near, and it will come as destruction from the Almighty. Has not food been cut off before our eyes, gladness and joy from the house of our God? The seeds shrivel under their clods, the storehouses are desolate, The barns are pulled up, for the grain is dried up. How the beasts groan. The herds of cattle wander aimlessly, because there is no pasture for them. Even the flocks of sheep suffer. To you, O Yahweh, I cry. For fire has consumed the pastures of the wilderness, and the flame has burned up all the trees of the field. Even the beasts of the field pant for you, for the water brooks are dried up, and fire has consumed the pastures of the wilderness. This is the word of the living God. It's not very often I read National Geographic magazine. I remember it was one of my favorites as a kid. Those full-color photographs from around the world, distant tribes being discovered. The most vivid in my mind was the edition that came out in sometime in the 1980s. That's when I came out, so that's when it came out. And it was one of those African tribes that puts the gold rings around the neck to elongate the neck of the women. And I remember being so interested. I remember looking at those pictures in other editions of polar bears with blood-stained ice from the polar bear regions, having slayed a seal or a person or whatever happened in the frame before, and just being generally fascinated by National Geographic magazine. In later years, I've read it less. I haven't completely lost interest in things natural and scientific, but I found myself just recently reading the National Geographic magazine. Not a recent edition, but one from December of 1915. Through the wonders of internet archives, I became an annual subscriber for $3 a year. And as I paged through this particular edition, the reason I signed up for it is I had some insider information that it would help me study the book of Joel. You see, locust plagues are something quite alien to us in our particular region. It's not that locust plagues don't exist in the world today. 2019 and 2020 in East Africa during all the COVID stuff, there was also a massive locust plague that gained some headlines, but folks were distracted by other more pressing matters. It wasn't a small issue, though. It affected East Africa and even all the way up to Pakistan. A swarm of locusts, 1 square mile wide, can eat enough food to provide meals for 80,000 people. And they can do that in one day. These little grasshoppers move in enormous swarms, 90 miles, sometimes further than that, in a single day. The other kind of recent phenomenon is 2003 in East Africa, where 23 West African countries were assaulted by 3 generations of locusts that emerged all at the same time. And it took 2 years to get that infestation under control. You can go back to 1845 and see accounts of significant locust attacks in Palestine and other places, but it is this National Geographic magazine that was published at the very end of the year 1915 that caught so many Americans' attention, because the author of this particular article, John D. Whitting, was not only an amateur scientist, he was also a biblical scholar. His article, quite lengthy, featuring 25 photographs and illustrations, is entitled Jerusalem's Locust Plague. And I promised you the three things we're going to accomplish tonight. One is learning about locusts. And the reason we have to do that is that the book of Joel's context is completely absorbed with this calamitous attack of these little bugs. And we can't understand the devastation that came to the land unless we understand just how devastating these things can be. This 1915 plague covered Palestine and Syria from the border of Egypt all the way to the Tarsus Mountains. The first swarms appeared in the spring. It was in March they began to notice these locusts, an ordinary animal in the region, insect, and something that they had grown quite accustomed to, and even swarms are not unusual there. But these adult locusts came from the northeast and moved southwest in clouds so thick that observers said that they concealed the sun itself. The female insects are about 2.5 to 3 inches long. And their first course of attack is to immediately begin laying eggs by digging holes 4 inches deep and depositing 100 eggs in each hole. The ground looks like someone took a pencil and poked a pencil in the ground millions of times. And it's those little tunnels that hold these hundreds and even thousands of eggs. 100 eggs in each hole, countless holes in cylindrical masses 1 inch long, and they're everywhere. Witnesses estimated that as many as 65,000 to 75,000 eggs were concentrated in a single square meter of soil. This much soil, 75,000 eggs. Patches like this covered the entirety of the land from north to south. And once they laid their eggs, they flew away. But a few weeks later, the young locusts emerged from their eggs. They look at first like big ants. No wings, and within a few days they move all over the ground. People say it's similar to fleas, the way they hop around. They're tiny and annoying, and they're everywhere. They start to move together in 400 to 600 feet spans every single day, and these tiny little infant grasshoppers devour everything they touch. Every green plant, every piece of food, everything is touched by these locusts. Everything that they encounter, they consume. Within a few months, they've molted. And by this stage, they have wings. And they still don't fly. Instead, they move forward, walking, jumping, only as people try to move through them. They turn bright yellow in this stage. It's called their gregarious stage. I remember when I was in my gregarious stage. And during that stage, they're attracted to one another. They find each other and they move like an organized army, molting yet again and becoming developed adults to attack the land another time. Having already eaten all green plants and stripped all the trees bare, there's pictures in this article of a fig tree in full bloom with leaves all over it. And you see it decimated in stages by the different stages of these locusts. First stripped of all its leaves, then stripped of its bark, and then down to just the bare skeleton, the tree is completely decimated. As Whitting describes in that 1915 article, the vineyards were attacked. Here's a direct quote from him. Once entering a vineyard, the sprawling vines would in the shortest time be nothing but bare bark. when the daintier morsels were gone, the bark was eaten off the young topmost branches, which after exposure to the sun were bleached snow white. Then seemingly out of malice, they would gnaw off small limbs, perhaps to get at the pith within. He goes on to describe that final stage of destruction begun after all these earlier waves of attacking olive trees. The tough, bitter leaves were not eaten by the first round of bugs, but this final round stripped, he says, every leaf, berry, even the tender bark. They ate away layer after layer of cactus plants, giving the leaves the effect of having been jack-planned. Even on the scarce and prized palms, they had no pity, gnawing off the tenderer ends of the sword-like branches, and diving deep into the heart, they tunneled after the juicy pith. This is what's happening in the book of Joel. This is the occasion of the prophet Joel's ministry. Now, some interpreters have gone wild and tried to make the locusts into something they're not. Apache helicopters or army people, something like that. As we move through our interpretation of the book of Joel, I'll try to show you why that's outrageous. I think the main argument is this is a perfect description, not of Apache helicopters, nor of some sort of military force. Instead, it employs the language of military force, in verse 6 in particular, and later places in the book of Job. But it describes exactly what those who've seen these locust swarms experience. This is not a small problem in the ancient world. I mean, the Hebrew language, the Old Testament, has 9 different words for locusts, 4 of them used in this passage. And it's not clear if they're different varieties of locusts that these words refer to, or just synonyms, because the people would get so sick of these creatures, they just needed a new word. But likely those 4 words used in this passage talk about the development of the locusts and their stages of devastation. Joel captures the nature of these creatures perfectly and accurately. I mean, verse 4's description, where it layers the 4 different kinds of locusts and their devastation being one after the other. It sounds exactly like Whitting's article and what he observed in 1915. He actually opens his article by quoting the book of Joel, a book that's different than so many of the other minor prophets, different than the book we just studied, different than Hosea, because Hosea has so much detail about the background and the connection to the kings in which he served and the region, the historical period. Joel has none of that. You'll notice the beginning, there is no association with a particular king or reign, and students who studied the book of Joel have functioned like detectives trying to figure out what year this was, even what century, and interpreters differ by a century or more in when this book was composed, most landing in a post-exilic time, some linking it to the rule of the evil queen who is the product of Ahab and Jezebel's union, but it's all conjecture. When we think about the specific historical background of this book, all we have is grasshoppers. It was a time of a locust invasion that absolutely decimated Jerusalem and the surrounding area. And to think of how devastating, how consuming, how brutal this really was, we just have to think of Israel's history. It was a plague like this one that was one of the stones that fell in bringing the Exodus about. It was a plague like this one that devastated Egypt back when Israel was slaves there. And having been through this kind of thing before, at least historically, and certainly having dealt with the plague of locusts in smaller parts of their history, this one was unlike any plague they'd ever seen personally. It's why in those opening verses, verse 2 and 3, he asks the question, has anything ever happened like this before? Has it ever been this bad? You see, this book has so much for us, and to understand the plague of locusts is to understand a time of disaster, a time of devastation, a time of calamity. And though we may not know what it's like to have locusts fill our homes and crawl through every crack and enter into every jar and consume every morsel that they can find, and though we can read about what that would have been like, we understand the nature of devastation. I mean, so many are waiting, even in our own country, to find out exactly what remains in Tonga. A massive volcanic eruption followed by a devastating tsunami just days ago knocked out all communications from that remote island. Observable from space, I'm sure you've seen the footage of that volcano coming up all the way to the atmosphere. We understand days of devastation. We understand tragedy. And I think the fact that Joel doesn't link to a particular kingship or a particular period in any obvious way in his prophecy only makes its universality more evident. It's easy to apply the book of Joel. You don't have to have dealt with deadly grasshoppers to understand that there are things that take place in our lives that are devastating. Sometimes we call them natural disasters in the form of an earthquake or a hurricane or a typhoon or a tsunami or a raging wildfire or mudslides, or sometimes it's a darker force that has obvious human element behind it. But whatever it is, we can resonate with the ministry of Joel because he speaks to a time of complete and utter devastation. And if we didn't have the book of Joel, we wouldn't have as much information that we do about God's judgment. Joel will teach us as we study it about the day of the Lord, a day of judgment that is foreshadowed here but promised in the future, a day where God will judge his own nation and surrounding nations with perfect judgment, a day of cataclysmic judgment to come that all other cataclysms foreshadow. If we didn't have the book of Joel, we wouldn't have one of the most poignant and memorable statements and descriptions of true repentance in the entire Bible in Joel 2, verse 13, when he says, "Tear your heart and not your garments, and return to Yahweh your God, for he's gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in loving kindness, and relenting concerning evil." We wouldn't have one of the strongest statements of hope in the entirety of the Old Testament. Chapter 2, verse 18, Yahweh will be zealous for his land. He'll spare his people. Yahweh will answer and say to his people, "Behold, I'm going to send you grain, new wine, and oil, and you'll be satisfied and full with them. And I'll never again make you a reproach among the nations. I will remove the northern military force far from you. I'll drive it to a parched and desolate land, and its vanguard into the eastern sea, its rear guard into the western sea. Its stench will rise up, its foul smell will rise up, for it has done great things." He goes on to say, "Rejoice, O sons of Zion, and be glad in Yahweh your God." It's a compelling statement of hope in this bleak backdrop of devastation. If we didn't have the book of Joel, we wouldn't have that prophecy that closes out Joel chapter 2. God's promise to pour out his Spirit, one that Peter preached in his sermon on Pentecost that was attended with the signs and wonders that confirmed the pouring out of God's Spirit. And if we didn't have the book of Joel, we wouldn't have as great understanding of the eschatological judgment that's to come with the end of all things. So the book of Joel has for us so much pertaining to the future, but so much for us right now. So much to prepare us to face the difficulties in life, whether they be natural disasters or wayward children or heartbreak of another kind. Joel ministers to people who live in a fallen world and who've tasted the most difficult aspects of that fallenness. And so let's dive in together to the book of Joel and let's learn what it's like to hear the gospel with the sound of grasshoppers all around us. Look with me at verse 1, the word of Yahweh that came to Joel, the son of Pethuel. I told you that the book itself is rather mysterious. It's hard to know what else we can know about Joel. All we have is his father's name, Pethuel. And the only thing we know about his father, which can be surmised from the name he gave his son, the name Joel, this is the only time we hear from this prophet Joel in the entire Bible. The name Joel is relatively common. It occurs 12 times in the Old Testament. There's different Joels running around, much like there is today. Greetings to the Joels in the room. But this Joel, his name means Yahweh is God. It's a statement of faith from his father. But the opening line of this prophecy is what sets our attention on how significant its words are. Verse 1, the word of Yahweh that came to Joel, the son of Pethuel. Hear this, O elders, and give ear, all inhabitants of the land. This is the word or message of Yahweh. This isn't just the words of a prophet. This is the word of God through his prophet. The prophet, like Scripture, serves as God's mouth. And so when Joel speaks, sometimes he speaks in the first person. Other times God speaks directly through his prophet. When we study the book of Joel, when we learn about this locust plague and we see how God's people were to react to this devastating reality, we are hearing from God himself. The word, the message of Yahweh that came to or was received by Joel, the son of Pethuel. This son of a faithful father who named him Yahweh as God carries on his father's testimony by speaking on behalf of God. And that's how revelation works. When we open our Bibles, we're not just hearing the words of a man, we're hearing God speak through his servant. And that's how this text sets itself up with the very opening line. It also insists that we respond to it, that we give it a listen, that we hear. He addresses the elders, the leadership of Israel, and tells them, hear this, O elders. It's an imperative verb commanding them to listen. And then again in verse 2, give ear, all inhabitants of the land. These days of crisis and catastrophe are going to be embedded into the national conscience, and the prophet calls the entire nation to hear from God and calls them all towards a lament, a mournful cry, a prayer of complaint and devastation. He asks some rhetorical questions after that in verse 2 and 3. Has anything like this happened in your days? Or in your father's days? And they insist on the pedagogical nature of what's happening in this crisis. This is something worth looking at. This is something worth recording, worth remembering, worth recounting to your sons, and worth your sons telling their sons about it all the way to the next generation. And Joel fulfills that prophecy and fulfills that imperative demand that by writing his prophecy down. It forever records these days of crisis, these difficulties, so that God's people would always remember how they responded to this crisis. Verses 2-4 show that general call for the elders and all people and the generations that are to follow. Be aware of this widespread devastation. And so his appeal is likewise, it's widespread. And then you have in really poetic form 3 strophes and 5 lines of meter piling up, opening lines, classic prophetic intro, imperative verbs of hearing. Hear this, O elders, give ear, all inhabitants, followed by those rhetorical questions. Has this ever, anything like this ever happened before? That's pleasant in the microphone. Sorry about that. I think there's something noteworthy here. He's calling on the inhabitants of the land and the leaders of the land, and in a moment, the rest of society categorically, to think about something that was so prevalent, so destructive. What else would they do? If a volcano went off in the San Fernando Valley, it's all we would be talking about, if we're talking anymore. And it's interesting to me that Joel is insistent that the people continue to meditate and contemplate the devastation that they've faced. This is a different approach to life than some life coaches would sell you. This is a different kind of Joel than the Joel in Houston. The Joel in Houston, you know what he says? He says, before you leave the house, you need to make up your mind that you're going to stay positive and enjoy the day no matter what comes your way. You have to decide ahead of time. That's the Joel in Houston. And it's the polar opposite of what the real Joel is doing. The real Joel isn't saying, put on a Pollyanna face here. It'll get better. Have a be happy attitude. Grasshoppers, aren't they yellow and gregarious? You got to look at the bright side of things, don't you? That's not at all what's happening here. Not this Joel. This ugly reality is intended to capture the attention of every inhabitant of the land. One author says it this way. Throughout his poem, the prophet insists that the catastrophe and the victims of catastrophe have lost what constitutes the very essence of their existence. I mean, he just keeps rolling over the reality of the bad things that have happened to God's people. The Pew Research Center for Christianity Today, which is more today than Christianity, did a study just at the end of last year where they surveyed 6,500 Americans, most of who claimed to be believers. And they asked them about theonomy, the problem of evil, the existence of suffering. And the majority of them said that suffering comes from the actions of people, not from God. The actions of people not from God. 6,500 Americans are practically atheists when it comes to suffering. In contrast, try Martin Luther. This is what he said. He deserves to be called a theologian, however, who comprehends the visible and manifest things of God seen through suffering and the cross. Do you want to be a theologian? You're not trying to get God out from responsibility of the bad things that happen, but it's comprehending the visible and manifest things of God seen through suffering and the cross. Joel doesn't say, let's not think about unpleasant things. Let's lament. This catastrophe demands a response to God because it's God's catastrophe. The sovereignty of God over everything makes us look at everything, the good, the bad, and the ugly, through the lens of his meticulous sovereignty. Nothing, dear believer, passes into your life that has not first passed through the fingers of God. It's not your responsibility to ignore that reality, but to embrace that reality. And after describing the different devastations, the fourfold destruction that this wave after wave of locusts has done to the land and to the people, in verse 4, he starts to look at the rest of the people categorically, and he looks at an unlikely group, verse 5, the drunkards. He calls them to wake up and weep. Drunkards, alcoholics, however you like to call them, are usually oblivious to their surroundings. Most often, they're the ones unaffected by their circumstances because they intentionally have blocked them out by seeking the bottom of the bottle or the wineskin, in their case, in the ancient world. But Joel wants the drunkards to be aware that even this element in society will be devastated by this locust plague. You see, these creatures have eaten the fruit of the vine. All of it, the potential harvest is gone. All that's left in the wineskin, and likely those have been destroyed by this devastation as well. Everything is cut off, even from this lowest and most destitute part of society. And so he calls the drunkards to listen and to lament. In verse 6, he compares this locust plague to a human army. Look at what verse 6 says. It says, "For a nation has come up against my land. Mighty and without number, its teeth are the teeth of a lion. It has the fangs of a lioness. It's made my vine a desolation." This is how some have tried to miss the point of the literal depiction and misunderstand the simile here. But if you understand a locust plague, you understand how much these creatures are like an army. From a different account than the one I read you earlier, this one's from 1845, but also in Palestine, or I think this was in Lebanon, same region. W.M. Thompson described the locusts this way. Their number was astounding. The whole face of the mountain was black with them. On they came like a living deluge. We dug trenches and kindled fires and beat and burned to death heaps upon heaps, but the effort was utterly useless. Wave after wave rolled up the mountainside and poured over rocks, walls, ditches, and hedges, those behind covering up and bridging over the masses already killed. After a long and fatiguing contest, I descended the mountain to examine the depth of the column, but I could not see to the end of it. It was perfectly appalling to watch this animated river as it flowed up the road and ascended up the hill. Later, he's greeted by a Muslim man who tells him to give up because it's Allah's army. These grasshoppers are not Allah's army. They are Yahweh's army. And like a nation, and like lions, verse 6, and a lioness with their fangs. One of the accounts I read told a horrifying story of an infant in a field whose face was consumed by this moving spread of locusts. Relentless, brutal creatures. And so not only is the lowest of society to wake up, but verse 9, the priests are to mourn, the ministers of Yahweh. You see, this has affected them as well. The new wine is gone, the fresh oil fails. And then he looks at another element of society. He'll return to the priests in a moment as he calls them towards lament. And in verse 11, he speaks to the farmers. And in the imperative, again, he says, be ashamed. Their work is devastated. I mean, you could probably work in an office for quite some time and be under the radar for your boss. But farmers can't. I mean, the fruitfulness of their work is quickly evident. And here, the daily rhythms of their life is completely destroyed. The farmer's oil and wine and grain, all parts of the main crops, the staples of Israel, are gone. The wheat and the barley, wheat being the more expensive, barley being the less expensive. Neither one is available anymore. They've all been consumed. The field has perished, verse 11. The vine dressers, they're done for, verse 12. The fig trees are ruined. The pomegranates, the palms, the apple trees, all the trees of the field dry up. This is affecting every part of society. I think the summary statement in verse 12 is helpful. Playing on that same word of everything is dried up. All these fruits are gone. All of them are destroyed. Joy itself has dried up. The clergy is devastated. The farmers are devastated. The drunks are devastated. That clergy portion, the priests. You see, this reference to Zion is likely a reference to Jerusalem. He'll refer to Zion, the sons of Zion, in chapter 3. He refers to the daughters of Zion in chapter 1. And so he's probably thinking about Jerusalem, and at the center of life in Jerusalem is one thing. It's temple worship. The daily rhythms of devotion were practiced there. Morning sacrifices, grain offerings, wine offerings. Oil was an essential part of the rituals of worship in Israel. And so many of the Psalms, passages like Deuteronomy 7:13, Hosea 2:8, they all speak of oil and wine and grain as these crops being things that bring gladness to our heart, things that show the bounty of God. But here these phrases are falling like hammer blows, reminding us that even worship itself has been disrupted because the people are on the brink of starvation and destruction. This brutal calamity has beaten them down, farmers and drunks, vine dressers and priests, wheat and barley, figs and pomegranates, apples, and in fact, not only have those crops dried up, but rejoicing has dried up. If this was a painting, it looked like dark, heavy brushstrokes, black and gray, and foreboding and sorrowful. And so Joel calls for lamentation. He calls for a lamentation starting in verse 13. Gird yourselves with sackcloth and lament, O priests. Wail, O ministers of the altar. Come, spend the night in sackcloth, O ministers of my God, for the grain offering and the drink offering are withheld from the house of your God. You see, they can't even do the rituals they're used to doing in the worship of Yahweh anymore. And so Joel calls them to begin their response to this devastating tragedy with lament, a call for lamentation. And lament is something that's not immediately familiar to us. We like songs that are more praisey and upbeat. But 40 of the 150 songs in the Psalter are laments. And this call to lament increases in intensity and extension in verses 13 and 14. And day and night are the extremes of this fast that's called for, the wearing of sackcloth, the personal nature of it, as Joel speaks of my God. That made it a lot better. Lament is a historical prayer language of God's people. It's the way that we're supposed to process pain. It brings us low. It humiliates the hurting. And if nearly of a quarter of the Psalms are like this, it's no wonder we're bad at grieving. We're bad at mourning in a culture that hides death every chance we get. You see, lament tells us to turn to prayer rather than despair. Lament teaches us that honest speech of complaint is something that God can welcome from us, that He knows who we are, He knows our weakness, He knows what we're feeling, and asking God to help us is part of lament. And lament usually ends with this focus on trust and hope in God, that He can be trusted when life is hard and nothing is left. And so Joel calls the priest to pray all night. Verse 14, fasting, a physical expression of spiritual reality. Verses 15 through 18, just like back in verse 2. Here he lists the actual lament. Here's the prayer they're supposed to pray. Alas for the day, verse 15, for the day of Yahweh is near, and it will come as destruction from the Almighty. Here we have a hint. Just a hint of something that we'll explore a lot more next week and in weeks to come. Apparently, the trouble isn't over. The locusts have left. All that remains is devastation. But now a reference to the day, verse 15, and then to Yahweh's day. The prophets who went before Joel, Ezekiel, Isaiah, all spoke of this day, a day of future judgment, of God's wrath on sometimes on Israel and most usually on every nation. And here he hints that the tragedy that they faced in this particular plague was a foreshadowing of a greater day of wrath to come. There's a play on words here. Verse 15, it will come as destruction from the Almighty. In Hebrew, it's shod from Shaddai. It's as if to say, shattering from Shaddai. That's that name of God that means the Almighty One. It speaks of his omnipotence. And shattering is this breaking that's coming from God Almighty. He depicts in this lament in verses 16, 17, 18, the crops failing, the animals in distress. Starvation is a very real possibility here. And as Joel instructs the priests and all the people to turn to God in prayer, he gives them the end of this lament in verse 19 and 20. And so I think we've accomplished at least two things tonight. We've We've learned about locusts, probably more than you ever wanted to know. We've seen what it means to lean into lament. But the most important lesson when you face a tragedy like this one is you look to the Lord. And that's what Joel does so instructively. First in verse 14, at the end of the verse, cry out to Yahweh. And now in the ultimate expression of lament, in verse 19 and 20, Joel tells them to pray this way: to you, O Yahweh, I cry. For fire has consumed the pastures of the wilderness, and the flame has burned up all the trees of the field. Even the beasts of the field pant for you. The water brooks are dried up. The fire has consumed the pastures of the wilderness. You have two sets of 3 lines of poetry there, and 2 times Yahweh is cried out to by name, crying out, calling to him, seeking God. If Shaddai is the one who brought the shattering devastation, then Shaddai is the one that we'll turn to in prayer. You see, Joel knew God. And he saw his entire world through that lens of a God-centered approach to all things. And what we find in the book of Joel, and what we'll see in weeks to come, is that when everything that we rely on is taken away from us, what is there left to trust? There's no food, there's no economy, there's no security, no protection, no guarantee of future provision. All we have has been destroyed, and all that's left is to call out to God, to trust only in God and in his grace and in his Son and in his mercy. When all that remains is God, the question of lament is this: when all that remains is God, do you have all that you need? And so they are to call on the name of Yahweh to be saved. You know, in previous generations, people talk about revivals today. They usually plan them like Wednesday night at 7, this church is having a revival, which is not how that works. But in previous centuries, they weren't called revivals. They used a word that we saw in our text tonight. They called them awakenings. And when tragedy strikes, whether it's in Tonga or Toluca Lake, we need to see that as an occasion to wake up and trust in God and God alone. And when we do, we will see every difficult tragedy as a foretaste of final judgment and a promise of hope for those who trust in God alone. Father, thank you for your word. So much richness here. We long to explore it and to be shaped by it. Thank you for your Spirit that teaches us. And I pray that as we study this book in coming weeks, we will continue to have confidence that you and you alone are God, and you are the one who saves and delivers by your merciful and good hand. Father, thank you for this good day that we've had together as a church, the clear reminder this morning of the centrality of conversion. Father, if there's any here tonight who don't know you, I pray that they would make their way to the prayer room under the exit sign and talk to a counselor, have some of their questions answered, meet someone to pray with them. I don't doubt that there's people in this room who have difficulties that they're facing in their life, plagues and storms of their own. Father, would you meet them in their time of need? May they turn to you and trust in your Son, in whose name we pray. Amen.